Episode 2: The Human in the Loop Illusion. Welcome to the Decision No One Owned, a podcast about artificial intelligence, power, human judgment, and responsibility. I am Nikolaos Akkizidis, author of The Decision No One Owned, a novel of artificial intelligence, power, and the courage to be responsible. In the first episode, we asked a fundamental question: who owns the decision when artificial intelligence helps make it? Today, I would like to go one step further, because there is a phrase we hear constantly in discussions about artificial intelligence, a phrase that sounds reassuring: responsible, safe, human. The phrase is human in the loop. The idea sounds simple. Artificial intelligence may analyze, it may recommend, it may classify, it may predict, it may even prepare the decision. But before anything important happens, a human being remains involved. Someone reviews, someone approves, someone clicks, someone signs. And because a human is still there, we tell ourselves that human judgment remains in control. But does it? Imagine an employee sitting in front of a computer screen. Every day, hundreds of recommendations appear: approve, reject, escalate, review. The artificial intelligence system has performed well for months, perhaps years. Its accuracy appears impressive. Management trusts it. Colleagues trust it. The organization has invested millions in it, and the employee has perhaps 20 seconds to review each recommendation. The screen displays recommended action, approve. The employee checks a few details. Everything appears normal. Click, approve. Next case, approve. Next case, approve. Next case, approve. Technically, there is a human in the loop, but I want to ask a more difficult question. Is there human judgment in the loop? Because human presence and human judgment are not the same thing. A person can be physically present and still have very little meaningful control over the decision. They may not understand how the recommendation was produced. They may not have access to the relevant evidence. They may not know what assumptions were made. They may not have enough time to investigate. They may not have authority to reject the recommendation. And even if they technically have that authority, they may understand that challenging the system creates consequences. Perhaps the system has been approved by senior management. Perhaps it has been tested by experts. Perhaps regulators know about it. Perhaps the organization has already declared it successful. Now imagine being the junior employee who says, "I disagree." Not because the system clearly failed, but because something does not feel right. Because context is missing. Because the recommendation may be technically reasonable, but humanly dangerous. Could these kinds of employees challenge the system? Could they? And perhaps more importantly, would the organization protect them if they did? This is where the human in the loop idea becomes much more complicated. Because a human being cannot exercise meaningful judgment simply because an organization places their name beside an approval box. Meaningful oversight requires something more. The person needs knowledge, they need time, they need context, they need access to evidence, they need authority, they need alternatives, they need to understand potential consequences, and they need the institutional protection necessary to challenge, modify, escalate, or reject what the machine recommends. Otherwise, the human can become little more than a rubber stamp. And that creates a very dangerous situation. Because when everything works, the organization celebrates the intelligence of the system. But when something goes wrong, suddenly everyone remembers the human who clicked approve. Think about that. The system may have framed the recommendation. The interface may have shaped the choice. The institution may have established the process. Management may have approved the technology. The model may have produced the output. But at the end, one human being pressed a button. And that person can become the convenient answer to the question, who was responsible? This is one of the concerns explored in the decision no one owned. A human should not be placed inside a system merely to absorb responsibility that the architecture itself failed to carry. That point matters because responsibility should not be something institutions search for after damage occurs. Responsibility should exist before the decision is made, before the loan is rejected, before the payment is blocked, before the investment is executed, before the customer is classified as suspicious, before the patient is deprioritized, before the employee is screened out, before the citizen loses access to a service. Before the consequence, someone must have the genuine ability to understand, challenge, and own the decision. And this is where automation creates a subtle psychological problem. The better the technology becomes, the harder it may become for humans to disagree with it. Imagine a system that is correct 98 times out of 100. That sounds excellent. But after hundreds of correct recommendations, what happens to the human reviewer? Confidence grows, attention fails, challenge becomes less frequent. Eventually, the recommendation no longer feels like a recommendation. It begins to feel like the answer. And the human role changes from what should we decide to is there any obvious reason not to accept what the system already decided? That is a completely different relationship. The machine is no longer supporting human judgment. Human judgment is beginning to validate machine judgment. And once that happens, the hierarchy of decision making has quietly changed. This issue becomes especially important in finance. Imagine an AI system evaluating credit applications. It considers thousands of variables. It identifies patterns no individual analyst could detect manually. Its historical performance is impressive. So now consider a scenario in which an analyst assessing a credit application receives the following recommendation. Reject. But what does meaningful human oversight actually require? Is it enough for an analyst simply to click a box marked rejected? The answer is no. The analyst must be able to ask, why is this applicant being rejected? What evidence drove the result? What assumptions were used? Is the data complete? Is the result consistent with the applicant's actual circumstances? Could the model be relying on a proxy that creates unfair consequences? What happens if this recommendation is wrong? And do I have the authority to change it Without these possibilities, the human is present, but responsibility is weak. The point is that the same reasoning can be applied elsewhere, in compliance, in fraud detection, in investment management, in insurance, in healthcare, in employment, in public services, in security, in government. The question is not merely, was a human involved? The real question is, could that human meaningfully exercise responsibility? This distinction changes how we think about governance, because governance is not simply about adding more approvals, more forms, more committees, more signatures, more people inside the loop. Because sometimes adding another approval layer creates the appearance of control without creating real control. 10 people can approve a decision and responsibility can still disappear. If everyone assumes someone else understood the model, someone else reviewed the evidence, someone else considered the consequences, someone else had authority, someone else would intervene if necessary, then collectively nobody may truly own the decision. This is the responsibility gap, the distance between the power to influence a consequence and the duty to answer for it. Artificial intelligence can widen that gap because decision making becomes distributed. The developer creates one component, the model provider creates another. The data comes from somewhere else. Management approves deployment. An external consultant validates. A committee reviews. A human operator clicks. Everybody participates. Yet, responsibility can become increasingly difficult to locate. So, what would meaningful human oversight look like? First, the human must understand the purpose of the decision, not only the output. Second, the human must understand the context. What is happening around this case, what the machine may not fully see? Third, the human must have access to relevant evidence, not simply a recommendation score. Fourth, the human must have sufficient time, because 5 seconds of approval is not meaningful oversight. Fifth, the human must have genuine authority, the ability to challenge, modify, escalate, or reject. And finally, the person must not be punished merely because they exercised responsible judgment in good faith. Because if an organization says, you are free to challenge the AI, but everyone knows that challenging it damages your career, then you are not really free. Meaningful oversight requires institutional protection. Otherwise, obedience will often look like agreement. And that leads us toward a larger idea. Perhaps the problem is not simply whether we have a human in the loop. Perhaps the more important question is whether we have built a structure around the human that makes responsibility possible. Because a human without knowledge can become decoration. A human without authority can become cover. A human without context can become blind. A human without time can become a rubber stamp. A human without protection can become obedient. and a human without a challenge path can become silent. So maybe the future of responsible artificial intelligence requires something more than human in the loop. Maybe we need to move toward what I described as structure in the loop. Human in the loop asks, is a human present? Structure in the loop asks, is responsibility actually possible? That distinction will become increasingly important because the future cannot depend on one unusually courageous employee standing at the end of an automated process trying to resist the momentum of an entire system. Responsibility should not require heroism. It should be built into the decision environment itself. And that is where we'll continue going in this podcast. But before we examine the structure, there is another transformation we need to understand. Because artificial intelligence rarely becomes powerful overnight. It enters quietly, first as a tool, then as an advisor, then as a recommendation engine, then as something people depend upon. And eventually, a difficult question emerges. When does assistance become dependence? That will be the question for episode 3. Until then, I leave you with one thought. A human being does not remain responsible simply because their finger is the last thing between an algorithm and a decision. Because responsibility requires the ability to understand, to question, to challenge, to change direction, and when necessary, to say no. Artificial intelligence may become increasingly capable, but human oversight only matters when human judgment remains real. This is the decision no one owned. Responsibility must still be ridden by us.